And the unfortunate reality about this problem is that it's largely invisible, especially from a point of view of one lifetime or one decade, or at least in an observable sense. And there are always short-term interventions that seem more immediate and they seem more like they require immediate action. But our greatest struggle here is actually to just readjust our climate and to try and undo, if we can, or if not, at least adapt to all this climate damage that we've done. And while the conversation about climate, it can circle around a few different things, it seems, at least in the mainstream media, that it always comes back to the idea of natural disasters. And there is a huge body of literature in the sciences that link extreme weather, such as heat waves and tropical storms and all sorts of examples, with human-induced anthropogenic climate change. There are strong causal links that are found with changes in temperature, precipitation, storms, floods, droughts that are sort of mutually affecting each other. So one worsens the other, similar to the social element that I just described. And in the images I've put up here, I tried to get a snapshot of maybe the 2 or 3 most reported climate-induced disasters. We've heard a lot about wildfires this year. We started with a huge global discussion on the Australian bushfires. Of course, we all know about what's going on in Brazil with the slash and burn policies in the Amazon. Right now, my former home state of California is going through a lot of wildfires, and even within our own context, we just talked about how this is a big problem in the Nepali context as well. But I think what's important here is that we look at this climate problem, and particularly the climate-induced disaster problem in particular contexts, from a people point of view, as well as also from an isolated geographical point of view. And while it is completely true that when it comes to problems of the world, there is no such thing as borders, we are all in this together. But we do have different regions of the world that face different kinds of threats, each of which is equally important to be addressed. So to begin quickly describing the Nepali context, this is my home country that I'm most familiar with. I think, our speakers before have already given a really good snapshot of what the climatological truth is in this context here, but I've included this, this quick topographical geographical map. And there's 2 things that you can look at this map and then immediately think of. First thing that's noticeable is that we are a landlocked country. And so much of climate damage conversation is around this idea of sea levels rising. The water will come. Floods will happen. So immediately, subconsciously, one intuitively thinks, oh, okay, so this is a landlocked country. But another thing that's immediately obvious when we look at it is just the complete complex and diverse geography that exists in our tiny, tiny country. From the thin sort of blanket of white all the way at the top, which is of course the Himalayan region with some of the highest points in the world, including the highest point in the world, in fact, Mount Everest, all the way going down to our, down in elevation and also down in the map to our areas that are surrounding the Indian borders, where it's pretty plain. These areas face droughts every year. So from this point of view, it's a little difficult to discuss vulnerability for Nepal particularly because of this sort of difference in how we look at the climate problem itself. And one thing that I've really been advocating for in my short career doing this has been to look at things from a purely social and human point of view. 70% of our country's population works in some form of agriculture, some form of farming industry. And I'm saying working population because there's a huge chunk of our country's working age population that works abroad. A big chunk of our GDP actually comes in the form of remittances. So there's Nepalis out there in the world with very little security blanket that's a virtue of our impoverished status. And then we're in all sorts of different climates, and even within our own country there's estimates about 30 to 35% of our GDP comes directly from agriculture. Another 10 to 20% comes from agriculture adjacent industries that would be impacted if agriculture itself is impacted. And of course, needless to say, when we're talking about any, probably when we're talking about any developing country, there are long-term issues like slow economic development, a lot of political unrest. I mean, my country has been through so much politically in the last few decades. Governments have been overthrown. Entire constitutions have been written and rewritten. We have inequality in a huge nationwide scale, not just in terms of economic inequality, but social inequality, all sorts of marginalized groups being oppressed in different levels. Corruption is still a big, big problem in our country. So one such study that I found, which was most recent as 2018, according to my research, showed that Nepal actually ranks 4th in the world when you were considering all these issues.